The intelligence briefing that morning had put everyone on edge, though Sarah only learned about it later from whispered conversations in the mess hall. Taliban forces had been moving through the surrounding mountains, and reconnaissance flights had spotted unusual activity in villages that were normally quiet. The base commander had increased security patrols and placed everyone on high alert. Sarah noticed the change immediately when she arrived for the breakfast shift. The soldiers seemed more tense than usual, speaking in lower voices and checking their weapons more frequently. The SEAL team that usually kept to themselves was nowhere to be seen, which meant they were likely preparing for a mission outside the wire. Marcus, her fellow cook, had dark circles under his eyes. He told Sarah that he had barely slept because of the increased helicopter traffic throughout the night. Transport aircraft had been coming and going, bringing in additional supplies and personnel. Something big was definitely happening, though none of the kitchen staff knew exactly what. The base sat in a strategic valley that controlled access to several mountain passes used by smugglers and insurgents moving between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Intelligence suggested that a large group of Taliban fighters was planning to attack the base to eliminate the American presence in the region. If they succeeded, it would open up crucial supply routes for enemy forces. Throughout the morning, Sarah watched as soldiers prepared for whatever was coming. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Extra ammunition was distributed. Medical supplies were positioned strategically around the base. The helicopter landing pad was cleared and marked for potential evacuations. Everyone moved with the efficient urgency of people who knew their lives might depend on their preparation. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader she had noticed before, appeared in the dining hall around noon. Sarah had never seen him during lunch hours, so his presence confirmed that something unusual was happening. He grabbed a quick meal and spoke quietly with several other team members who joined him at a corner table. Sarah tried not to stare, but she couldn't help noticing how different the SEALs looked compared to the regular soldiers. They carried themselves with complete confidence, as if they had trained for every possible scenario and were ready for anything. Their equipment was different too, more specialized and customized for their specific missions. The afternoon brought disturbing news from the intelligence team. Intercepted radio communications suggested that the enemy attack would come that night, possibly involving over 100 fighters armed with mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, and automatic weapons. The base's defensive capabilities were strong, but they would be severely outnumbered if the intelligence was accurate. Sarah found herself thinking about her family back home as she prepared what might be the last meal for many of the soldiers on the base. Her sister had just started her senior year of high school and was worried about college applications. The concerns that had seemed so important when Sarah left Texas now felt impossibly distant and trivial. The evening meal was quieter than usual, with an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel, but nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. Soldiers ate quickly and efficiently, knowing they needed energy for the long night ahead. Some wrote letters home just in case. Others cleaned their weapons one more time or checked their body armor. Jennifer, the supply specialist, pulled Sarah aside after dinner cleanup. She had overheard part of a briefing and knew that the enemy was planning to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The goal was to overwhelm the base's defenses and eliminate as many American forces as possible. The Taliban wanted to send a message that no position in Afghanistan was safe from their reach. As darkness fell over the mountains, Sarah could feel the change in atmosphere around the base. Guard positions were reinforced, night vision equipment was deployed, and communication systems were tested repeatedly. The base's defensive perimeter was designed to handle most attacks, but everyone knew that determined fighters with enough numbers could potentially breach their defenses. The SEAL team had left the base shortly after sunset, though Sarah didn't know their mission details. She had seen them loading into helicopters with full combat gear, their faces painted with camouflage and their weapons ready for action. Whatever their role in the coming battle, it would be dangerous and crucial to the base's survival. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah was finishing the final kitchen cleanup when the first alarm sounded. It wasn't the general alert she had heard before during drills, but a specific warning that meant enemy contact was imminent. She could hear vehicles moving around the base and soldiers taking their assigned defensive positions. Marcus and Jennifer joined Sarah in the kitchen, unsure of where they were supposed to go. Their training had covered basic combat situations, but they were support personnel, not frontline fighters. The kitchen area had been designated as a potential casualty collection point if the medical facilities became overwhelmed, so they decided to stay and prepare for whatever was coming. The radio chatter coming from the communication center was constant but difficult to understand. Sarah could make out references to movement in the mountains and requests for air support. The base's defensive systems were tracking multiple groups of enemy fighters approaching from different directions, just as the intelligence had predicted. Looking out through the kitchen window, Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the darkness beyond the base perimeter. The enemy was probing their defenses, testing response times and looking for weak points. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky like deadly fireworks, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the surrounding mountains. The base's return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun positions opened up on suspected enemy locations, and mortar teams began dropping rounds on coordinates provided by spotters with night vision equipment. The noise was deafening, and Sarah had to fight back panic as the reality of combat surrounded her. Then came the whistling sound she had been taught to recognize during training. Incoming mortars. The kitchen lights went out automatically as the base switched to blackout conditions, and Sarah found herself crouching behind a steel table as explosions shook the building. Dust fell from the ceiling and she could smell smoke and cordite in the air. This was no longer a drill or a distant threat. The enemy had found them, and the battle for forward operating base Chapman had begun. Sarah clutched her hands together to stop them from shaking and tried to remember her training as the sounds of war erupted all around her. In the darkness, she wondered if she would live to see morning, and whether anyone back home would ever know what happened to the girl, who had only wanted to serve her country by cooking meals for soldiers far from home. The intelligence briefing that morning had put everyone on edge, though Sarah only learned about it later from whispered conversations in the mess hall. Taliban forces had been moving through the surrounding mountains, and reconnaissance flights had spotted unusual activity in villages that were normally quiet. The base commander had increased security patrols and placed everyone on high alert. Sarah noticed the change immediately when she arrived for the breakfast shift. The soldiers seemed more tense than usual, speaking in lower voices and checking their weapons more frequently. The SEAL team that usually kept to themselves was nowhere to be seen, which meant they were likely preparing for a mission outside the wire. Marcus, her fellow cook, had dark circles under his eyes. He told Sarah that he had barely slept because of the increased helicopter traffic throughout the night. Transport aircraft had been coming and going, bringing in additional supplies and personnel. Something big was definitely happening, though none of the kitchen staff knew exactly what. The base sat in a strategic valley that controlled access to several mountain passes used by smugglers and insurgents moving between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Intelligence suggested that a large group of Taliban fighters was planning to attack the base to eliminate the American presence in the region. If they succeeded, it would open up crucial supply routes for enemy forces. Throughout the morning, Sarah watched as soldiers prepared for whatever was coming. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Extra ammunition was distributed. Medical supplies were positioned strategically around the base. The helicopter landing pad was cleared and marked for potential evacuations. Everyone moved with the efficient urgency of people who knew their lives might depend on their preparation. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader she had noticed before, appeared in the dining hall around noon. Sarah had never seen him during lunch hours, so his presence confirmed that something unusual was happening. He grabbed a quick meal and spoke quietly with several other team members who joined him at a corner table. Sarah tried not to stare, but she couldn't help noticing how different the SEALs looked compared to the regular soldiers. They carried themselves with complete confidence, as if they had trained for every possible scenario and were ready for anything. Their equipment was different too, more specialized and customized for their specific missions. The afternoon brought disturbing news from the intelligence team. Intercepted radio communications suggested that the enemy attack would come that night, possibly involving over 100 fighters armed with mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, and automatic weapons. The base's defensive capabilities were strong, but they would be severely outnumbered if the intelligence was accurate. Sarah found herself thinking about her family back home as she prepared what might be the last meal for many of the soldiers on the base. Her sister had just started her senior year of high school and was worried about college applications. The concerns that had seemed so important when Sarah left Texas now felt impossibly distant and trivial. The evening meal was quieter than usual, with an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel, but nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. Soldiers ate quickly and efficiently, knowing they needed energy for the long night ahead. Some wrote letters home just in case. Others cleaned their weapons one more time or checked their body armor. Jennifer, the supply specialist, pulled Sarah aside after dinner cleanup. She had overheard part of a briefing and knew that the enemy was planning to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The goal was to overwhelm the base's defenses and eliminate as many American forces as possible. The Taliban wanted to send a message that no position in Afghanistan was safe from their reach. As darkness fell over the mountains, Sarah could feel the change in atmosphere around the base. Guard positions were reinforced, night vision equipment was deployed, and communication systems were tested repeatedly. The base's defensive perimeter was designed to handle most attacks, but everyone knew that determined fighters with enough numbers could potentially breach their defenses. The SEAL team had left the base shortly after sunset, though Sarah didn't know their mission details. She had seen them loading into helicopters with full combat gear, their faces painted with camouflage and their weapons ready for action. Whatever their role in the coming battle, it would be dangerous and crucial to the base's survival. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah was finishing the final kitchen cleanup when the first alarm sounded. It wasn't the general alert she had heard before during drills, but a specific warning that meant enemy contact was imminent. She could hear vehicles moving around the base and soldiers taking their assigned defensive positions. Marcus and Jennifer joined Sarah in the kitchen, unsure of where they were supposed to go. Their training had covered basic combat situations, but they were support personnel, not frontline fighters. The kitchen area had been designated as a potential casualty collection point if the medical facilities became overwhelmed, so they decided to stay and prepare for whatever was coming. The radio chatter coming from the communications center was constant, but difficult to understand. Sarah could make out references to movement in the mountains and requests for air support. The base's defensive systems were tracking multiple groups of enemy fighters approaching from different directions, just as the intelligence had predicted. Looking out through the kitchen window, Sarah could see muzzle flashes in the darkness beyond the base perimeter. The enemy was probing their defenses, testing response times, and looking for weak points. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky like deadly fireworks, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the surrounding mountains. The base's return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun positions opened up on suspected enemy locations, and mortar teams began dropping rounds on coordinates provided by spotters with night vision equipment. The noise was deafening, and Sarah had to fight back panic as the reality of combat surrounded her. Then came the whistling sound she had been taught to recognize during training. Incoming mortars. The kitchen lights went out automatically as the base switched to blackout conditions, and Sarah found herself crouching behind a steel table as explosions shook the building. Dust fell from the ceiling, and she could smell smoke and cordite in the air. This was no longer a drill or a distant threat. The enemy had found them, and the battle for forward operating Base Chapman had begun. Sarah clutched her hands together to stop them from shaking, and tried to remember her training as the sounds of war erupted all around her. In the darkness, she wondered if she would live to see morning, and whether anyone back home would ever know what happened to the girl who had only wanted to serve her country by cooking meals for soldiers far from home. The attack came in waves, each one more intense than the last. Sarah crouched in the kitchen with Marcus and Jennifer as explosions rocked the base around them. Through the reinforced windows, she could see tracer rounds cutting through the darkness like deadly streaks of light. The enemy had positioned themselves in the mountains surrounding the base, giving them elevated firing positions that were difficult to counter. The base's defensive systems were responding with everything they had. Machine gun nests returned fire at muzzle flashes in the hills, while mortar teams worked frantically to drop rounds on enemy positions. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar of gunfire punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle shots and the deep boom of explosions. Sarah's radio training kicked in when she heard frantic calls for medical assistance coming from the communication center next to the kitchen. Several soldiers had been wounded by shrapnel from a mortar round that had landed near the main gate. The base medic was already treating casualties, but more help was needed. Without thinking about her own safety, Sarah grabbed the first aid kit from the kitchen wall and ran toward the sound of voices calling for help. Marcus tried to stop her, but she was already out the door and moving across the open ground between buildings. Bullets whined overhead, and she could feel the heat from tracer rounds passing close by. The wounded soldiers were behind a concrete barrier near the communication bunker. Sarah could see that one Marine had taken shrapnel in his leg and was losing blood quickly. Another soldier was conscious but dazed from a blast that had thrown him against a wall. The medic was working on a third casualty who seemed to be in critical condition. Sarah had learned basic first aid during her Navy training, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of treating combat wounds under fire. She focused on the Marine with the leg injury, using her belt as a tourniquet to stop the bleeding while keeping as low as possible behind the concrete barrier. The young man couldn't have been more than 19 years old, and he kept asking for his mother. The communication equipment in the bunker was crucial for coordinating the base's defense, but the soldiers operating it were pinned down by sniper fire from the mountains. Sarah realized that someone needed to maintain radio contact with the helicopter gunships that were providing air support, or the base's defensive coordination would break down completely. Jennifer appeared beside her, carrying medical supplies from the kitchen. She had ignored Marcus's protests and followed Sarah into the combat zone. Together, they helped move the wounded soldiers to a more protected position, while the medic continued working on the most seriously injured man. The sound of helicopter rotors overhead indicated that air support was arriving. The radio crackled with urgent communications as the helicopter pilots requested target information from ground spotters. Sarah could hear the pilots reporting enemy positions and coordinating with the base commander to provide effective fire support. The distinctive sound of helicopter cannons opened up on the mountainside, followed by the whoosh of rockets being fired at enemy positions. But the enemy had anticipated air support and had prepared countermeasures. Sarah watched in horror as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked up from the mountains toward one of the helicopters. The pilot managed to evade the attack with a sharp banking maneuver, but it was clear that the Taliban fighters were well equipped and determined to overrun the base. The intensity of the battle increased as more enemy forces joined the attack. Intelligence reports coming through the radio indicated that over 200 fighters were now involved in the assault, far more than the original estimates. They were attacking from 3 different directions simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the base's defensive perimeter and break through to the main facilities. Sarah found herself helping to coordinate medical, evacuations and ammunition resupply while staying in radio contact with different units around the base. Her experience managing kitchen operations had given her organizational skills that proved valuable in the chaos of combat. She could track multiple tasks simultaneously and communicate clearly under pressure. The SEAL team was still missing from the base, and Sarah began to worry about what had happened to them. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and his men had left hours before the attack began, but there had been no radio contact since their departure. She wondered if they had been ambushed while on their mission, or if they were fighting their own battle somewhere in the mountains. Around midnight, the enemy launched their most determined assault yet. Dozens of fighters had worked their way close to the base perimeter under cover of darkness, and they began attacking the defensive positions with grenades and automatic weapons. The sound of close-quarters combat was different from the long-range exchanges that had dominated the earlier fighting. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from just outside the perimeter fence, which meant enemy fighters had managed to get within 100 yards of the main buildings. The base's defenders were holding their positions, but they were taking casualties and running low on ammunition. Several defensive positions had gone silent, indicating that they had either been overrun or abandoned. The base commander's voice came over the radio, calling for immediate air support on the perimeter positions. The situation was becoming critical, and Sarah realized that the base might actually be overrun if help didn't arrive soon. She thought about her family back home and wondered if they would ever know what happened to her if the base fell. Then she heard a different sound, cutting through the noise of battle. It was the distinctive roar of jet engines at low altitude, followed by the earth-shaking explosion of bombs being dropped on enemy positions in the mountains. Air Force fighter jets had arrived to provide close air support, and their precision strikes were devastating. The enemy forces that had been attacking from elevated positions, the tide of battle began to turn. As the enemy's coordinated assault started to break down under the intense aerial bombardment, Sarah could hear Taliban fighters retreating through the mountains, their radio communications becoming increasingly frantic as they tried to regroup and escape the devastating airstrikes. But the fight was far from over. Enemy forces were still active around the base perimeter, and Sarah knew that the most dangerous part of the battle might still be ahead. In the darkness and confusion, it was impossible to know how many enemy fighters remained or what they might try next. All she could do was continue helping with medical care and communication, while hoping that morning would bring an end to the longest night of her life. As dawn approached, the intensity of the battle began to shift from the chaotic firefights of the night to more strategic movements. Sarah had spent the entire night moving between wounded soldiers, helping with communications and doing whatever was needed to keep the base functioning under attack. Her hands were stained with blood, and her uniform was torn from crawling across rough concrete, but she had discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. The radio chatter indicated that enemy forces were regrouping in the mountains, but they had taken heavy casualties from the airstrikes. Several Taliban commanders had been killed or wounded, which disrupted their coordination and command structure. However, intelligence reports suggested that they were preparing for one final assault designed to capture or destroy key facilities on the base. Sarah was treating a soldier's minor shrapnel wounds when she heard a familiar voice on the radio that made her heart skip. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was calling in from somewhere in the mountains, reporting that his SEAL team was alive and had been conducting reconnaissance and harassment operations against enemy forces throughout the night. The SEAL team had infiltrated behind enemy lines before the attack began, using their specialized training to gather intelligence and disrupt Taliban preparations. They had been calling in airstrikes on enemy positions and eliminating key leaders with precision sniper fire. Their actions had prevented the enemy from mounting an even larger and more coordinated assault on the base. Morrison's voice was calm and professional as he reported his team's position and requested extraction. Sarah found herself listening intently to every word, relieved to know that he and his men had survived the night. The SEAL team had been fighting their own dangerous battle in the mountains, while she had been helping defend the base. The base commander immediately began coordinating helicopter extraction for the SEAL team, but it would be extremely dangerous. Enemy forces were still active in the mountains, and any helicopter attempting to reach Morrison's position would be vulnerable to rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine gun fire. The pilots would have to fly through a gauntlet of enemy positions to reach the extraction point. Sarah volunteered to help coordinate the extraction operation from the communication bunker. Her experience managing multiple tasks simultaneously made her valuable for tracking the helicopter's approach, monitoring enemy activity, and maintaining contact with the SEAL team. The operation required split-second timing and flawless communication to succeed. The extraction helicopter was a heavily armed transport that could defend itself, but it would still be vulnerable during the pickup. Fighter jets would provide cover by attacking enemy positions along the flight route, while artillery from the base would create a protective barrage around the extraction point. Every available resource was being used to bring the SEAL team home safely. As the helicopter approached the mountains, Sarah could hear Morrison's team engaging enemy forces near their position. The SEALs were fighting a running battle while moving toward the extraction point, using their superior training and equipment to outmaneuver larger numbers of Taliban fighters. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed through the radio as the team fought their way to safety. The helicopter pilot's voice was tense but professional as he reported, taking fire from multiple positions during his approach. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of bullets hitting the aircraft's armored hull, and she held her breath as the pilot maneuvered through the dangerous terrain while under attack. One mistake or mechanical failure would doom everyone aboard. Morrison's voice came through clearly as he guided the helicopter to the exact extraction point. Sarah could hear the rotor noise in the background of his transmission, indicating that the aircraft was close to landing. The SEAL team would have only seconds to board before enemy fire became too intense for the helicopter to remain on the ground. The tension in the communication bunker was overwhelming, as everyone listened to the extraction unfold. Sarah found herself gripping the radio handset so tightly that her knuckles were white. She had never met Morrison personally, but she had watched him for weeks and felt a connection that she couldn't explain. The thought of losing him and his team now was unbearable. Then Morrison's voice confirmed that all team members were aboard, and the helicopter was lifting off. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but the danger wasn't over yet. The aircraft still had to fly back through enemy territory while carrying wounded passengers and dealing with potential mechanical problems from the damage it had sustained during the approach. The flight back to the base seemed to take forever, though it was actually only a few minutes. Sarah tracked the helicopter's progress on radar while listening to radio reports from the pilot. Enemy forces were still firing at the aircraft, but the combination of air cover and defensive maneuvering kept it safe from serious damage. Fighter jets were suppressing enemy positions along the return route. When the helicopter finally appeared over the base, Sarah ran outside to watch it land. The aircraft was smoking from bullet holes in the engine compartment, and she could see damage to the main rotor blades. The pilot had performed brilliantly under extremely difficult conditions, and everyone aboard was lucky to be alive. The SEAL team emerged from the helicopter looking exhausted but triumphant. Morrison was helping one of his men who had been wounded during their mountain operations, but he was moving under his own power. Sarah watched from a distance as the team was debriefed by base command, and their wounded teammate was taken to the medical facility for treatment. The extraction had been successful, but the battle for the base wasn't over yet. Enemy forces were still active in the surrounding area, and intelligence indicated they were preparing for another attack. The Taliban commanders had invested too much in this operation to give up easily, and they would likely try again before retreating from the region. Sarah returned to her duties in the communication bunker, but she couldn't stop thinking about the courage she had witnessed during the extraction operation. The helicopter crew had risked their lives to save the SEAL team, while Morrison and his men had spent the entire night fighting behind enemy lines to protect the base. Everyone had done their job with skill and bravery under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. As morning light spread across the mountains, Sarah realized that she was no longer the same person who had been serving breakfast just 24 hours earlier. The battle had changed everyone on the base, but it had shown her capabilities she never knew she possessed. She had proven to herself that she could function under pressure and contribute meaningfully when lives were at stake. The morning brought an eerie quiet to the base as enemy forces retreated deeper into the mountains. Sarah found herself exhausted but unable to rest, adrenaline still coursing through her system from the intense night of combat. The base looked like a war zone, with damaged buildings, scattered equipment, and evidence of the fierce battle that had raged for hours. Medical teams were working frantically to treat the wounded, and Sarah continued helping wherever she was needed. She had discovered that her organizational skills and ability to remain calm under pressure made her valuable in crisis situations. The base commander had specifically requested that she continue, assisting with communication and coordination rather than returning to kitchen duties. Lieutenant Commander Morrison appeared in the communication bunker around noon, looking tired but alert. He had been debriefed extensively about his team's mountain operations, and he wanted to thank the personnel who had coordinated their extraction. When he approached Sarah, she felt her heart rate increase for reasons that had nothing to do with combat stress. Morrison's green eyes met hers directly as he extended his hand. His voice was deeper than she had expected, and when he spoke, she could hear the exhaustion and relief of someone who had spent the night fighting for his life. He thanked her specifically for her role in coordinating the helicopter extraction, explaining that her clear communication had been crucial to their survival. Sarah found herself tongue-tied in a way that surprised her. She had been giving orders and coordinating operations all night, but now she could barely string together a coherent response to Morrison's simple expression of gratitude. There was something about his presence that made her feel both nervous and oddly comfortable at the same time. The conversation was brief, but Morrison mentioned that he had noticed her competence during the battle and suggested that she consider applying for additional training when her current deployment ended. The military needed people who could think clearly under pressure and coordinate complex operations in dangerous situations. Sarah realized he was essentially offering to recommend her for advancement. Over the following days, as the base worked to repair damage and strengthen defenses, Sarah found herself assigned to increasingly important duties. The base commander had recognized her performance during the battle and wanted to utilize her skills more effectively. She was given additional responsibilities for communication coordination and emergency planning. The enemy attack had failed, but intelligence reports indicated that Taliban forces were still active in the region. The base remained on high alert and everyone knew that another attack was possible. Sarah helped develop new defensive procedures and communication protocols based on lessons learned from the recent battle. Morrison's SEAL team was preparing for another mission, this time to track down the remaining enemy forces and prevent them from regrouping for another assault. Sarah found herself providing logistical support for their mission planning, which gave her opportunities to interact with Morrison more frequently. Their conversations gradually became less formal and more personal. Sarah learned that Morrison was from Colorado and had been in the Navy for 12 years. He had joined the SEALs because he wanted to serve at the highest level and make a real difference in protecting American interests around the world. His dedication to his mission was obvious, but Sarah also sensed a loneliness that came from the demanding lifestyle of special operations. During one conversation, Morrison asked Sarah about her background and her plans after the military. She found herself sharing details about her life that she rarely discussed with anyone, including her dreams of using her military experience to pursue a career in emergency management. Morrison listened carefully and offered insights about leadership and decision-making that she found incredibly valuable. The base received intelligence about a large cache of weapons and explosives that the enemy had hidden in the mountains before their attack. The Taliban forces planned to retrieve these supplies and use them for future operations against American forces. Morrison's team was tasked with locating and destroying the cache before it could be recovered. Sarah was assigned to help plan the mission communication protocols and extraction procedures. Working closely with Morrison on the planning process, she gained a new appreciation for the complexity and danger of special operations missions. Every detail had to be considered, and backup plans were needed for every possible scenario. The night before the mission, Morrison sought out Sarah in the communication center. He seemed more serious than usual, and Sarah could sense the weight of responsibility he carried as team leader. He asked if she would personally monitor the mission communications and coordinate any emergency support that might be needed. Their conversation lasted longer than necessary for mission planning, and Sarah realized that Morrison was as interested in talking with her as she was with him. Despite the professional nature of their relationship, there was an undeniable personal connection developing between them. Both of them seemed to recognize it, even though neither was willing to acknowledge it directly. The mission was scheduled to begin before dawn, and Morrison's team would be inserted into the mountains by helicopter under cover of darkness. They would have to hike several miles through enemy territory to reach the weapons cache, destroy it, and return to an extraction point without being detected. The operation was extremely dangerous, especially since enemy forces were actively patrolling the area. Sarah spent the evening reviewing communication, procedures, and emergency protocols with the helicopter crews and air support units that would be standing by during the mission. She wanted to ensure that if something went wrong, help would be available immediately. The thought of Morrison and his team being stranded in the mountains was almost unbearable. As the SEAL team prepared for insertion, Sarah watched Morrison check his equipment with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. His weapons were perfectly maintained, his gear was arranged for maximum efficiency, and his focus was absolute. She was struck by the realization that this might be the last time she ever saw him. When Morrison passed by the communication center on his way to the helicopter, he paused to speak with Sarah one final time. Their eyes met, and in that moment both of them seemed to acknowledge the connection that had developed between them. Morrison's expression was serious, but Sarah thought she detected something warmer underneath his professional demeanor. The conversation was brief and focused on mission details, but when Morrison said goodbye, his voice carried a personal note that hadn't been there before. Sarah realized that he was as affected by their relationship as she was, even though both of them were trying to maintain professional boundaries in a combat environment. As the helicopter carrying Morrison's team disappeared into the darkness, Sarah settled into the communication center for what she knew would be a long and anxious night. She would monitor every radio transmission and coordinate any support that might be needed, knowing that the lives of 4 highly trained warriors depended partly on her ability to do her job perfectly. The mission began smoothly, with Morrison's team successfully inserted into the mountains without enemy contact. Sarah monitored their progress through brief radio check-ins, tracking their movement toward the weapons cache while coordinating with air support units that were standing by to provide assistance if needed. The communications center had become her command post, and she felt the weight of responsibility for the team's safety. 3 hours into the mission, Morrison reported that they had located the weapons cache. The enemy stockpile was larger than intelligence had estimated, containing enough explosives and ammunition to supply a major offensive operation. The SEAL team began setting charges to destroy the entire cache, working quickly and efficiently in the darkness while maintaining security against possible enemy patrols. Sarah could hear the tension in Morrison's voice as he reported their progress. The team was deep in enemy territory, and every minute they remained at the cache increased the risk of discovery. Taliban forces were actively searching for the Americans who had disrupted their previous attack, and the mountains were crawling with hostile patrols looking for revenge. The explosion that destroyed the weapons cache lit up the sky like artificial dawn, visible from the base even though it was miles away in the mountains. The blast was much larger than expected, indicating that the cache had contained a massive amount of explosives. Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction knowing that those weapons would never be used against American forces, but the celebration was short-lived. The explosion had revealed the SEAL team's location to every enemy force in the area, and Morrison immediately reported that they were taking fire from multiple directions. Taliban fighters had been positioned around the cache site, apparently expecting an American operation. The SEALs had walked into a carefully planned ambush. Sarah's training took over as she coordinated immediate air support for the surrounded team. Fighter jets were scrambled from a distant airbase, and helicopter gunships were launched from forward operating bases to provide close air support. But it would take time for help to arrive, and Morrison's team was heavily outnumbered and under intense fire. The radio transmissions from the mountain became increasingly desperate as the SEAL team fought for survival against overwhelming odds. Morrison reported that one of his men had been wounded and they were running low on ammunition. Enemy forces were closing in from all sides, and the team was trapped in a rocky outcropping with limited defensive positions. Sarah found herself making split-second decisions that could mean life or death for Morrison and his team. She coordinated with artillery units to provide supporting fire, directed helicopter pilots to attack enemy positions, and maintained constant communication with the trapped SEALs to help guide friendly fire onto enemy targets. Her voice remained calm and professional despite the chaos of the situation. The first air support arrived in the form of attack helicopters that immediately engaged enemy positions around the SEAL team's location. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter cannons and rockets through Morrison's radio, followed by his reports of enemy casualties. But Taliban fighters continued to press their attack, determined to eliminate the Americans who had destroyed their weapons. Morrison's voice became strained as he reported that his wounded teammate was losing blood and needed immediate medical evacuation. The team was still surrounded, and any helicopter attempting to land would be shot down by enemy fire. Sarah realized that she needed to coordinate a complex rescue operation involving multiple aircraft and precise timing to save Morrison's team. Working with the helicopter crews, Sarah developed a plan to use covering fire from attack helicopters while a medical evacuation aircraft approached the SEAL team's position. Fighter jets would attack enemy positions in the surrounding area, while artillery from the base would create a protective barrage around the extraction point. The operation would require perfect coordination and split-second timing. The medical evacuation helicopter pilot was experienced but clearly nervous about attempting a landing in such a hostile environment. Sarah could hear the concern in his voice as he reviewed the approach route and discussed the risks with his crew. One mistake or equipment failure would result in the loss of both the helicopter crew and the SEAL team they were trying to rescue. As the rescue operation began, Sarah found herself orchestrating a deadly ballet of military assets. She coordinated the timing of artillery strikes, guided attack helicopters to specific target coordinates, and maintained constant communication with Morrison's team to ensure that friendly fire would not endanger the trapped SEALs. Her voice became the central link connecting all elements of the rescue effort. The sound of the approaching medical helicopter was audible through Morrison's radio as the aircraft flew through intense enemy fire toward the SEAL team's position. Sarah could hear bullets striking the helicopter's armored hull, and the pilot's tense reports of damage to his aircraft. The crew was risking their lives to save Morrison and his men, and everyone involved knew that failure was not an option. Morrison guided the helicopter to a small clearing near the team's defensive position while his men provided covering fire against enemy forces that were trying to prevent the rescue. The wounded SEAL was unconscious and would need to be carried to the aircraft under fire. Sarah coordinated suppressing fire from multiple sources to give the team the best possible chance of reaching safety. The extraction took only minutes, but it felt like hours as Sarah listened to the radio transmissions from the mountain. She could hear Morrison's calm voice directing his team's movements while under intense fire, and the helicopter pilot's reports of increasing damage to his aircraft from enemy weapons. The rescue was succeeding, but barely, and everyone involved was operating at the absolute limit of their capabilities. When Morrison finally reported that all team members were aboard the helicopter and lifting off, Sarah felt a wave of relief that nearly brought her to tears. The medical evacuation aircraft was badly damaged and smoking, but it was flying and carrying 4 American heroes to safety. The rescue operation had been a success against overwhelming odds. The flight back to the base was tense as the damaged helicopter struggled to maintain altitude while flying through continued enemy fire. Sarah tracked the aircraft's progress on radar and coordinated with maintenance crews to prepare for an emergency landing. The pilot reported multiple system failures, and it was unclear whether the helicopter would make it back to the base. As the helicopter approached the landing pad, Sarah could see the extent of the damage through binoculars. The aircraft was riddled with bullet holes, one of the engines was smoking heavily, and the main rotor was vibrating abnormally. The pilot was performing a masterful emergency landing with an aircraft that should probably have crashed in the mountains. The helicopter touched down hard but safely, and medical teams immediately rushed to treat the wounded SEAL while maintenance crews worked to prevent an engine fire. Morrison emerged from the aircraft looking exhausted but alert, and Sarah realized that she had been holding her breath throughout the entire landing sequence. The rescue had been completed successfully, but everyone involved had been extremely lucky to survive. In the aftermath of the mission, Sarah found herself receiving praise from the base commander and other senior officers for her role in coordinating the rescue operation. Her ability to manage multiple communication channels simultaneously while maintaining calm under extreme pressure had been crucial to the mission's success. Morrison and his team were alive because she had done her job perfectly when it mattered most. The wounded SEAL was stabilized and evacuated to a major medical facility in Germany, where doctors were optimistic about his recovery. Morrison and the rest of his team were exhausted but uninjured, and they would be grounded for several days while they recovered from their ordeal. The mission had been a complete success despite the ambush, and the enemy weapons cache had been destroyed. That evening, Morrison sought out Sarah in the communication center to thank her personally for her role in their rescue. Their conversation was more personal than any they had shared before, and Sarah could see genuine gratitude and respect in his eyes. The professional barriers that had existed between them seemed to dissolve as they discussed the events of the day and their feelings about the mission. The weeks following the rescue mission brought significant changes to life on the base. Sarah's exceptional performance during the crisis had caught the attention of senior military leadership, and she received orders to report to the base commander's office for what she assumed would be a routine debriefing. Instead, she found herself being offered an opportunity that would change the trajectory of her military career. The commander explained that Sarah's demonstrated abilities in communication coordination, crisis management, and decision-making under pressure made her an ideal candidate for advanced training in military operations. He was recommending her for assignment to a specialized program that would prepare her for leadership roles in complex military environments. The opportunity was unprecedented for someone with her current rank and experience. Morrison had played a key role in the recommendation, providing detailed reports about Sarah's performance during both the base attack and the rescue operation. His assessment emphasized her ability to coordinate multiple assets simultaneously while maintaining clear communication under extreme stress. The SEAL commander's endorsement carried significant weight with senior leadership. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the unexpected opportunity, but also excited about the possibility of advancing her career in a meaningful direction. The specialized training would be challenging and demanding, but it would open doors to positions of real responsibility and authority within the military structure. She would be able to make a genuine difference in protecting American forces around the world. The personal relationship that had been developing between Sarah and Morrison also reached a turning point during this period. Their shared experiences during the recent battles had created a bond that went beyond professional respect, and both of them were struggling to navigate the complex emotions they felt while maintaining military discipline and professionalism. Morrison's tour of duty was scheduled to end in several months, and his SEAL team would be rotating back to the United States for training and recovery. Sarah's new assignment would also require her to leave Afghanistan, though her destination was still being determined by military planners. The prospect of separation added urgency to their relationship, even though both of them were careful not to violate military regulations. During one of their conversations, Morrison shared details about his life outside the military that revealed a more personal side of his character. He talked about his family in Colorado, his love of mountain climbing, and his plans for the future after his military service ended. Sarah found herself drawn to his thoughtfulness and the way he balanced intense dedication to his mission with genuine care for the people around him. Sarah also opened up about her own background and dreams, describing her childhood in Texas and her hopes for using her military experience to pursue a career in emergency management. Morrison listened carefully and offered insights about leadership and planning that helped her think more clearly about her future goals. Their conversations became increasingly important to both of them. The base received news that the Taliban forces responsible for the recent attacks had been largely eliminated or driven from the region. Morrison's team had been part of a larger operation that successfully disrupted enemy networks and eliminated key leadership figures. The weapons cache destruction had been a crucial element in preventing future attacks on American forces. With the immediate threat reduced, life on the base began to return to something resembling normal routine. Sarah continued her expanded duties in communication and operations planning, while also preparing for her eventual transfer to advanced training. The experience of proving herself under combat conditions had given her confidence that she could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. Morrison's team was preparing for their final mission in Afghanistan, a routine patrol operation designed to gather intelligence about remaining enemy activity in the area. The mission was considered low risk compared to their recent operations, but Sarah still felt anxious about Morrison's safety. She had become personally invested in his well-being in a way that went far beyond professional concern. The night before Morrison's final mission, he and Sarah had their most honest conversation yet about their feelings for each other. Both of them acknowledged the connection they had developed, while also recognizing the complications created by military regulations and their uncertain futures. They agreed to stay in contact after leaving Afghanistan, though neither knew exactly what that would mean. Morrison's final mission was completed successfully without incident, and his team returned to the base to begin preparations for their departure. Sarah helped coordinate the logistics of their rotation back to the United States, which gave her additional opportunities to spend time with Morrison during his final days in Afghanistan. The departure day arrived sooner than either of them had expected. Morrison's team was scheduled to leave on a transport flight that would take them first to Germany, then to the United States for debriefing and reassignment. Sarah found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected as she watched him prepare to leave. Their goodbye was necessarily brief and professional, conducted in front of other personnel who were unaware of the personal relationship that had developed between them. Morrison thanked Sarah formally for her support during their operations, but his eyes conveyed much more personal feelings that he couldn't express in the public setting. As Morrison's transport aircraft disappeared into the Afghan sky, Sarah realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by the experiences of the past few months. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed, and she had formed a connection with someone who had shown her what it meant to serve with honor and dedication. Sarah's own departure from Afghanistan came several weeks later, when she received orders to report for her advanced training program. As her transport helicopter lifted off from forward operating base Chapman, she looked down at the mountains where she had experienced some of the most intense and meaningful moments of her life. The base cook who had arrived months earlier was leaving as a tested leader with a bright future ahead of her. The specialized training program exceeded even Sarah's high expectations. providing her with advanced skills in crisis management, communication coordination, and leadership under pressure. Her instructors quickly recognized her potential, and she graduated at the top of her class with recommendations for assignment to high-level positions within the military structure. Morrison had kept his promise to stay in contact, and their relationship continued to develop through letters, emails, and occasional phone calls. The separation was difficult, but it also allowed both of them to focus on their careers while maintaining the emotional connection that had begun in the mountains of Afghanistan. Their shared experiences had created a foundation for a relationship that transcended the circumstances of their first meeting. Years later, Sarah would look back on her time as a base cook in Afghanistan as the period when she discovered her true potential and began the journey that would define the rest of her life. The young woman who had joined the Navy to escape a small Texas town had proven that heroism can emerge from the most unexpected places when ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things.